A bill has been introduced into Congress which aims to ban the purchase, sale, and possession of suppressors nationwide, and it also implements a mandatory confiscation/mandatory buyback. This is another scheme by the anti-gun side to change the laws and make something that was once illegal now completely illegal. And of course, they are doing all of this while ignoring the fact that suppressors are clearly protected by the text of the Second Amendment because they are clearly common arms, commonly owned and possessed by law-abiding people for lawful purposes. This bill is H.R. 2985, also known as the Help Empower Americans to Respond Act of 2023. The short title of this bill is known as the HERE Act. This is a bill that has been introduced in both the House and the Senate by Representative Watson Coleman and also Senator Menendez. And ultimately, the goal of this bill is to make it illegal to possess or buy suppressors in the US going forward. It does this by changing the law and then implementing a mandatory 90-day suppressor buyback. Now, before we dive deeper into this absurd piece of anti-gun legislation, I want to thank the sponsor of this video, which is Blackout Coffee. Blackout Coffee has some of the best coffee out on the market, and they are huge Second Amendment supporters. If you buy one of their dedicated roasts, like their FPC roast or their GOA roast, proceeds for those sales will go directly to those 2A organizations so they can fight this type of legislation. So go check out Blackout Coffee using the link down below and use the code ARMSCHOLAR for 10% off of your order. So the anti-gun politicians who introduced this bill claim that they need this and this needs to get passed and they need to ban suppressors because it's necessary to protect the public and it's in the public's interest to regulate and essentially ban these deadly and dangerous suppressors. Senator Menendez states that gun silencers are devices designed for a very specific purpose, to suppress the sound of gunfire from unsuspecting victims and reduce the chances they can run, hide, take cover, and call the police during one of these situations. It is well past time that we pass the HERE Act, legislation that would prevent arms assailants from using deadly devices that only make incidents of gun violence all the more dangerous. Watson Coleman, on her statement of the introduction of this bill, states that silencers are not tools of self-defense, they are tools of murder. They have no legal application, which is why law enforcement officials around the country have called for their elimination. The HERE Act will save lives, and it is part of the common sense approach to firearms legislation that has widespread support among voters on both sides of the aisle. Now, as you can see in the logic being used to introduce this bill, it's really all of the old and tired arguments about how suppressors are used by criminals and make firearms undetectable. As we all know, that's just not true. These statements show that these politicians know nothing about suppressors, and they are only getting their firearms education and information from the movies that they're watching. Maybe they're watching too much of John Wick, I get it. Those are awesome movies, but you see them using suppressors all the time in those types of movies and other movies as well. And the reality is how they're depicted in Hollywood is just not the reality. Now, the legal truth is that suppressors are in common use for lawful purposes. They are used and owned by law-abiding people for purposes like self-defense, despite what these politicians are arguing. Suppressors are owned and used by millions of law-abiding people for those lawful purposes. And as we've seen in multiple Supreme Court decisions, if something is in common use for lawful purposes, by its very nature, it cannot be defined as dangerous and unusual. And more importantly, an outright ban on their possession is a violation of the Second Amendment under the Supreme Court's decision in Heller. We wouldn't even need to use the Supreme Court's recent ruling in Bruin of text as informed by relevant history and tradition. We wouldn't even need to use that analysis because under Heller, an outright or categorical ban on this type of commonly possessed arm is never permissible. But an outright ban and mandatory buyback is exactly what this bill aims to implement. The bill states that, except as provided in paragraph 2, it shall be unlawful for a person to import, sell, manufacture, transfer, or possess in or affecting interstate or foreign commerce a firearm silencer or firearm muffler. That is an outright ban language that you have included in this bill. It's an outright ban on the possession of these types of items and on the sale and purchase of these items. Then the bill goes on to say that this is only going to be applied to the law-abiding, just the average person, but we are going to exempt the government and law enforcement. It states that this language should not apply to the importation for manufacture, for sale to, transfer to, or possession by the United States or a department or agency of the United States, or a state or department agency or political subdivision of the state, or a sale or transfer to or possession by a qualified law enforcement officer employed by the United States or a state. And it goes on and on and on about the exemption for law enforcement and government entities. This means that there is an outright ban on suppressors, but that ban will not apply to the government and also law enforcement. It's pretty typical where you see law enforcement and the government exempting themselves from these types of outright bans, and this bill is no different. Now, you may think to yourself, well, there's nothing they can ultimately really do because people are already in possession of suppressors. They have already paid their tax stamp to the government. Well, under this bill, they will fund a buyback system and then require that anyone in current possession of suppressors must, and I emphasize, must sell the item back to the government. This is essentially a mandatory confiscation. The bill states that during the 90-day period described in Section 6, the Attorney General shall establish and implement a buyback program to be carried out across the United States to purchase firearm silencers and firearm mufflers from individuals seeking to comply with the requirements of this act and the amendments made by this act. And this language would take effect on the date that is 90 days after the date of its enactment. So under this bill, there will be no grandfathering of people already in possession of suppressors. This will be a future sales ban and a future possession ban, and will also require the confiscation of the estimated 2.4 million suppressors already in the possession of law-abiding citizens nationwide. And the reality is, they would be able to enforce this because suppressors are NFA items registered with the government. That means they will have this really nice list of all the suppressors that are out there, who's in possession of them, and then after the 90 days, and after that runs out, they will be able to check and see who turned those items over and who didn't. And if you don't turn over those suppressors, then this bill makes you subject to these serious federal criminal violations and potentially imprisonment of up to 10 years. That means this is a really nasty bill that's going to implement some of our worst fears as gun owners. It is going to result in a complete ban on suppressors nationwide and then also forced confiscation. Now, do I think that this would ever pass? In my opinion, I think it's most likely that no, it won't pass, especially right now, but I wouldn't say that it never has a chance. As we all know, really all that's needed is some sort of mainstream incident where maybe a suppressor is used, something that's highly publicized. If something like that, if an event like that pops up, it's only a matter of time before a bill like this gets pushed even more heavily. And they would try to use a bill like this to completely ban suppressors. So really, like I said, we're just one incident away, something that's mainstream and publicized. Republicans currently control the House right now, but again, we've seen Republicans in the House, in the Senate, even presidents, compromise away our rights when something like this pops up. So this is something we should definitely be aware of and keeping our eyes on. Contact your representatives and let them know that you oppose this HERE Act, this new bill that's been reintroduced that seeks to ban suppressors nationwide. We need to make sure that something like this never gets any traction, that it doesn't get any support, and also just to help protect us against maybe something else popping up that would then create a greater push for a bill like this. Now, if you want to learn more about what's going on in other states in regards to suppressors like Texas and their efforts to remove the federal regulation of made in Texas suppressors, you can watch this video here on the screen. But as always, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.